Hello, my name is Spencer, and in my podcast called The Dictionary, I literally read from the dictionary, but add in my personal comments and stupid jokes to make it more interesting. Episodes are family-friendly, short, and air every single day on basically every podcast platform. Come join me on this journey filled with edutainment.
Hello and welcome to How Did This Not Get Made?
This is the podcast all about the movies you never saw, the scripts that were never filmed, and the ideas that never even made it to the page. My name is David Spencer.
And my name is Daniel Kaka. Right off the bat, I need to ask you, do you know who the Doctor is?
The Doctor, as in Doctor Who?
As in, wait, who?
Is that what we're talking about?
We are talking about Doctor Who today.
Oh, okay. Is that anything like Inspector Spacetime?
It is kind of like Inspector Spacetime.
Okay.
You know, you have a companion, a booth. You have magic tools of some sort.
Blimey, Inspector. Where have we wound up this time? The question isn't where, Constable, but when. Inspector, look out! Blog-ons! Eradicate.
I should probably say something about this that I'm sure people in our audience will be shocked to hear. I have never, ever seen any Doctor Who before.
And I am here to contradict that because I believe that you have, but never knew it.
Okay.
We'll get through that.
That's ominous.
Just so the audience does know, David, even though it's in the dark for most of Doctor Who, I was introduced to Doctor Who back when I was in college. Mm-hmm. And the first Doctor, which everyone says like the first Doctor you experience is always your favorite Doctor, kind of like the first Weird Al song that you listen to is always going to be your favorite Weird Al song from there on. And my first Doctor was David Tennant. And Stephen Moffat was, I believe, the showrunner at that time, but I definitely know for sure that it was David Tennant who was the first Doctor that I watched.
See, all I know about Stephen Moffat is Sherlock. I did watch the first couple seasons of Sherlock, a show that I hate and I think is a terrible TV show. I watched like 2 or 3 seasons back when everybody was like obsessed with the Sherlock, and I was like, I don't get why people like this show. And I feel like the rest of culture is kind of turned on Sherlock now as well.
It was a product of its time in a way.
It was not for me.
Before we get this episode started, I do want to give just a quick shout out to Amber Fontaine. She's a big Doctor Who fan, and she's been looking forward to this episode for quite a while once I told her that I was covering Doctor Who for one of our episodes. I will kind of warn everyone ahead of time. We are going to be going through the history of Doctor Who, but we are not going to really dive into the lore. What we're going to really do is just go into a lot of the production choices that were made that seeped into the storyline to then figure out what is lore within Doctor Who and kind of what explains a lot of the staples of Doctor Who and the decisions behind that. So
Doctor Who's one of those things that even if I've never seen a full episode, I've seen clips and I know a lot of the references. I know what a Dalek is and I know what those angels that cover their faces are.
Mm-hmm. I just watched that episode this morning and it's so good. It has Carey Mulligan in it.
Oh, really?
One of her early roles, and she's amazing in it.
Well, anyways, I know that it also had a reputation in the early years that it was kind of the low-budget, campy sci-fi.
Yeah.
I like that you're telling us that we're going to be hearing about stories of how production needs affected what happens in the story. I love stuff like that when like, oh yeah, this only happened because they had to film it this way or that way. And I love the way that real world things make creative decisions happen. And I feel like with a low budget sci-fi, you're definitely going to get that. So I'm excited to dive into that kind of thing.
It'll be a lot of fun to go into. I will say that Doctor Who is a big subject. In fact, there are podcasts that are dedicated to only Doctor Who and Doctor Who content. It's a lot to take in. So the condensed history that I have, it's going to inform a lot, but I will say that there are other podcasts, other shows that do really good deep dives into the lore of Doctor Who. But if you're here For the lore of Doctor Who and that history, I will not be providing that. So just keep that in mind. For those who are unaware of who Doctor Who is, or the Doctor, he is an eccentric alien traveler with great intelligence, exploring space and time with a TARDIS, which, if you didn't know, TARDIS is an acronym for Time and Space Relative Dimension in Space.
I did not know that.
It is a spaceship and time machine that's bigger on the inside while appearing as a small police booth from the outside, usually with the help of his sonic screwdriver, a do-it-all tool, and a companion, or many companions at some points, usually a human from the UK. He battles injustices throughout space and time. The very first Doctor Who episode actually premiered on November 23rd, 1963 on the BBC. Now, the episode actually started 80 seconds late than it was originally programmed, and that is because they were doing coverage of the JFK assassination, which happened the day before.
Weird.
The creator of Doctor Who is primarily credited to BBC head of drama at the time, Sidney Newman, with the help of the head of the script department, Donald Wilson, and staff writer C.E. Weber. So it seems like they were just kind of brainstorming. They're just like, well, what's a show that we can put together? So this wasn't really the IP of just like one person who's like, I have an idea of like this doctor, alien space traveler going through time. It's like more of like, what can we do? How can we do like a fun show where people are like jumping around in different points of space, and like how do you explain something like that?
Yeah, I feel like that's super different than the way things are now in TV, certainly. I mean, now it's all about the head writer, creator of the show. I wonder if there were more shows like that were just kind of written by committee in the 60s, or maybe it was an anomaly even for that.
I think they were still trying to figure it out, because like the idea of a showrunner, or the idea of like a creator of a property would be the showrunner throughout the series, was almost unheard of. It was really like one guy who would just pitch an idea, and then the TV show would then take over and just kind of run with it. Something you may not have known. So for Sidney Newman, along with creating Doctor Who, he also created The Avengers, which is a spy action comedy series, which was later adapted into the 1998 film with Uma Thurman, Ray Fiennes, and Sean Connery.
Yeah.
Throughout the run of the series, writer Anthony Coburn, story editor David Whittaker, and producer Verity Lambert contributed to the development of the show. So there's a lot of hands in the pot right now. It's a lot of different ideas coming from different directions to eventually come up with this. So whenever you are asked at like a cocktail party, like who created Doctor Who? I mean, you could say in short answer it was Sidney Newman, but it was a lot of people coming together to be like, we just need to figure this out.
Yeah.
At first, the premise of the show was to be an educational family program that would explore scientific ideas and important moments in history. While in development, they made a rule that the show would not contain any, quote, bug-eyed monsters. That would be soon thrown out the window when David Whittaker hired Terry Nation to write a story titled The Mutants. The original storyline was that the Daleks, an extraterrestrial species from the planet Skaro, interrogate with a tank-like metal casing, and the Tals, which is a humanoid race from the same planet, were attacked by aliens with a neutron bomb. In the revision, they removed the aliens who came down with the neutron bomb and made the Daleks the attackers instead. Nation would draw a lot of his inspiration from the Nazis. They're all rolling around like tanks, they're merciless, violent, and demand conformity by force while seeing themselves as an inferior race.
You will move ahead of us and follow my directions. This way.
The story title changed from The Mutants and is now known as The Daleks. The reason they kept the storyline, even though they stated they would never do any bug-eyed monsters, can actually be explained by producer Verity Lambert, who was quoted saying, "We didn't have a lot of choice. We only had the Dalek serial to go. We had a bit of a crisis of confidence because Donald Wilson was so adamant that we shouldn't make it. Had we had anything else ready, we would have had made that instead." So had that decision not gone away through, we probably wouldn't have like one of the most notorious villains known today.
Yeah.
To focus in on the Daleks just for a little bit, the design of the Doctor's most infamous nemesis originally was assigned to Ridley Scott, who was working as a designer for the BBC at the time. Yes.
Interesting.
That Ridley Scott. But due to scheduling conflicts, the assignment then went to Ray Cusick instead. When Nation wrote the script, he wrote that the mutants should have no legs. Their movements would be more of a glide, much like a Georgian National Ballet. In fact, some of the actors to operate the Daleks from inside were actually retired ballet dancers, and they would just wear these black socks so that you wouldn't see them walking around as much. Although if you look pretty closely, you can kind of see like little shadows of those feet kind of like scooting along in them. Because the show was rushed to be made, like what was mentioned before, Cusick was only given an hour to put together a design, and from that he claims the shape of the Dalek looking like a pepper shaker was because that is what he used to show the builders specifically how a Dalek can move.
Oh, he was trying to show how they move, but that ended up being the design for the Daleks themselves.
Yeah. So they're just like, just kind of like glide around, and they're like, all right, well,
That's
it's going to
funny.
look like a salt pepper shaker and just kind of go like that. So that's the reason why the Dalek looks like that. There was a claim from comedian Tony Hancock that the idea of the Dalek was stolen from him. Prior to their falling out, Hancock and Nation worked together as writers. Hancock had submitted a script that failed called From Plip to Plop, a comedy about a world destroyed by a nuclear apocalypse, and the survivors had to live in dustbins like robots to move around and protect themselves from radiation. Supposedly, when Hancock watched the episode, he yelled at the TV and he said, "That bloody Nation, he stole my robots!" The very first Doctor was portrayed by the late William Hartnell from 1963 to 1966.
What are we going to see and learn next, Doctor?
But unlike the old adage, my boy, our destiny is in the stars. So let's go and search for it.
At first, he was uncertain about accepting the role when the show was pitched to him. And this is around the time that it was still like a family program to be like, it's an educational thing. He's like, I don't know if I want to do like kids stuff. But he was convinced to take the lead anyway because it would prevent him from being pigeonholed into a lot of these like gruff military type roles. Hartnell played the role as a grumpy old man.
Well, what you need is a jolly good smack bottom.
Partially because, he was a grumpy old man. He was actually 55 at the time that he received this role. But one aspect that continued through every actor portraying the Doctor is his eccentric wandering around the set, much like with Captain Jack Sparrow almost, giving the character a lot more energy. So it turns out the reason why Hartnell decided to move around was because oftentimes he failed to learn his lines, and he had sides of the script taped to different set pieces around so that the camera wouldn't see them. So whenever he moved around, he was really just going to another side to see what his line was, and then he would go back to the character, say that line to them, go back to the set piece where the other script was hidden, go right back to the character. So that's the reason for his movement.
Wow.
Towards the end of his run, he suffered from an undiagnosed arteriosclerosis. His health was in decline, and he could no longer continue the show. For most shows, they would explain away the departure of a character and replace them with a similar character, much like with Community or New Girl, where they just replace an actor with a similar looking actor, or sometimes for the same role, like Ross's ex-wife, they just changed the actor, and that sometimes they would just end the show entirely, like 8 Simple Rules with the death of John Ritter. With Hartnell being a lead role, producer Innes Lloyd had to find a way to replace the Doctor in a way that would be accepted by audiences. They first thought about hiring an actor that would look and sound alike, but by Hartnell's suggestion, he recommended character actor Patrick Troughton to continue the role of the Doctor, stating, "There's only one man in England that can take over, and that's Patrick Troughton."
Our lives are different to anybody else's. That's the exciting thing. Nobody in the universe can do what we're doing.
What year would this have been?
This would have been 66.
66. Okay. The other thing that I always think of a role being recast many, many times is James Bond.
Yeah.
But this would have happened before Sean Connery stopped doing James Bond, because Sean Connery's last Bond film was 1967.
So maybe they got the idea from Doctor Who.
Possibly, yeah.
Because of this decision, the idea of the Doctor regenerating was introduced, and this would revolutionize the trajectory of the show and preserve its longevity.
And make it into something that can last forever!
Yeah. I'm going to go off on just a bit of a tangent here because I want to talk about two things. I want to talk about the TARDIS and I want to talk about the sonic screwdriver and kind of
All right.
where they began. So
the sonic screwdriver, which is basically a handheld R2-D2.
basically, yeah. But first with the TARDIS, we mentioned that it's an acronym. It's a time machine that the Doctor uses. Usually it's the Doctor and his companions. They will make their way through space and time using the TARDIS. The TARDIS actually made its first appearance in the very first episode, An Unearthly Child. Its first scene is in a scrapyard and subsequently malfunctions from time to time, which is a staple that stays consistent throughout the show. It's probably most famous for being bigger on the inside than on the outside because the interior exists in a separate dimension and contains infinite number of rooms. The interior has been known to change with the Doctor's appearance when they regenerate. The exterior has remained consistent as the blue British police box, which the idea of like the police box is actually still pretty old. Like even people who were watching it in the 60s, they had no idea what that was because it was already outdated.
Yeah.
The idea of the TARDIS came from the staff writer Anthony Coburn, who rewrote C.E. Weber's first draft of the pilot episode. Although not confirmed, but entirely probable, the use of the police box could have been a set piece that was recycled because of the show's initial low budget. One story claims that the box was used in a prior show of Z-Cars, while Stephen Moffat claims that it was reused from the show Dixie of Doc Green, which the BBC has contradicted Moffat's claim on that. So they're saying that that is not right. He's not speaking the truth there. Either way, credit for the first TARDIS to be built goes to designer Peter Burkacki for putting together the Doctor's time machine. For the infamous sound of the TARDIS ripping through time and space, Brian Hodgson created the sound by running the back door key of his mother's house along the bass strings of a gutted piano, and then electronically treated that recording to make it that weird, distorted, like... He wanted to create this illusion that like this TARDIS, this machine is like just entering through like space and time and it's like ripping a hole through the space-time continuum. Another staple I mentioned before was the sonic screwdriver, which did not actually appear in the first episode like the TARDIS. In fact, the first Doctor didn't even have a sonic screwdriver. The iconic Fix-It-All prop made its first appearance in the 6th episode of the 5th season, Fury from the Deep, which unfortunately became one of the permanently missing episodes of Doctor Who, and I'll explain that one later. The episode was written by Victor Pemberton. In it, the Doctor's first use of it is to examine a gas pipe to discover that a victim is trapped inside. From there, the device was used more frequently, mostly to like dismantle equipment, bypass locks, and in one episode, it was actually used as a welding torch. By the time the third Doctor, John Pertwee, came around, producer Barry Letts wanted to avoid the device to be used as like a cure-all tool, meaning that the sonic screwdriver couldn't be used as a cop-out whenever writers couldn't think of a way to get the Doctor out of a situation. The sonic screwdriver has certainly become a staple for each Doctor, and it's probably just as important as the Doctor's outfit, the TARDIS, and even his companions. Now, Patrick Troughton's performance had to be different, and yet feel like the same character. He was much younger at 46 when he got the role. Like I mentioned before, Hartnell was 55 when he was cast. Show creator Sidney Newman suggested that Troughton's performance should be like a, quote, cosmic hobo. The Doctor was much less grumpy, more silly, and yet could be dramatic at a drop of a hat.
There are some corners of the universe which have bred the most terrible things. Things which act against everything that we believe in.
Similar to Hartnell, Troughton portrayed the Doctor for 3 years, choosing to leave because of grueling work hours. During his run at the BBC, they were actually making around 40 to 44 episodes per year that he was there.
Wow.
So that is a lot. Usually a season will last a year, and usually seasons now will last like maybe 12 to 24 episodes.
Yeah.
And now the BBC is like cut down dramatically on the length of a series or the length of a season. Like if you look at later shows like The Office, the original British Office, I think the first season is 6 episodes long, I believe. In 1969, Troughton was replaced by John Pertwee,
I've reversed the polarity of the neutron flow, so the TARDIS should be free of the force field now.
who had asked his agent to apply for the role, to later found out that Pertwee was actually on a short list of those to be considered for the next Doctor. Their first choice was actually Ron Moody, who was unavailable. Pertwee portrayed the Doctor for 5 seasons, making him the longest-running Doctor, even though he was in the same amount of episodes as Patrick Troughton. They both did 132 episodes, but was actually fewer episodes than William Hartnell, who did 145 episodes. The production decided to reduce the amount of episodes per season to avoid what happened with Troughton and the whole burnout issue with the Doctors previously. The show would then make a major change when they went from black and white to its new Technicolor format. During Pertwee's saga, the show and his role were heavily influenced by 007 and James Bond movies. The Doctor was more dapper and the series had a lot more action. He even donned a cape, which was actually an influence from his grandfather. As for Pertwee's performance, being a comedic actor, he could no longer rely on just funny disguises or voices to create his character. The BBC's head of drama, Sean Sutton, would advise Pertwee to portray the Doctor as himself, or to quote him, he said, "Play John Pertwee." That's how we want you to play the Doctor. Towards the end of his run, he began to notice that he was not landing roles outside of Doctor Who and was afraid that he was going to get typecast as this one character, which was a similar concern to the other actors who portrayed the Doctor before him, and this began the search for a new Doctor. This kind of seems pretty relevant to like anyone who gets that Doctor Who role.
Yeah.
Like you now see them as the Doctor. So like whenever I see David Tennant, like when I watched Jessica Jones and David Tennant was in it, I was like, that's the Doctor. That's Doctor Who right there. And it's just so weird to see him in a role where he's mean, he's abusive, he's manipulative, and like I'd never have ever seen him do anything like that before.
Yeah.
So producer Barry Letts was recommended by Bill Slater, BBC's head of serials, to hire Tom Baker to be the 4th Doctor.
I can feel my hair curling. And that means either it's going to rain, or else I'm onto something.
Prior to, Baker was directed by Slater in a stage production of The Millionaires, but Letts was more impressed with his performance in The Golden Voyage of Sinbad. Before this gig, Baker was working in construction and did acting on the side. Wasn't that Harrison Ford as well? Didn't he do that? Where he was like a carpenter?
Yeah, he was doing carpentry.
And then just kind of did acting here and there. Tom Baker's outfit is probably the most recognizable outfits of all the Doctors, especially with his larger-than-life multicolored scarf. Like, even if you're not familiar with Doctor Who, like, you know that scarf.
I've definitely seen that scarf. Oh, yeah.
So the story behind this extra-long scarf was when costume designer James Exon, he gave the assignment to Begonia Pope to knit together a wool scarf. He had given her multiple spools of wool, hoping that she would choose the best color, but through some miscommunication, she ended up using all of the colors.
That's amazing.
Everything was so unique about Tom Baker, his eccentric nature, his voice, his quick wit, his improv, and his enjoyment of jelly babies.
Would you care for a jelly baby? Try one. They're rather good.
With a new Doctor came a new change in direction for the show. When Letts left the production, he was replaced with Philip Hinchcliffe, who brought on Robert Holmes as a script editor. They wanted to create a show for an adult audience, and with the inspiration of Hammer Films production, they wanted to take on a darker and scarier tone. If you don't know, Hammer Productions in the late 50s, they produced a lot of these horror films like The Curse of Frankenstein, in which I looked at the casting for this.
Christopher
Lee was in it. He was the monster in Frankenstein. But do you know who played Victor Frankenstein?
No.
Peter Cushing.
Oh, yes, of course. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And then they also made Dracula, in which Christopher Lee was Count Dracula. Mm-hmm. And then do you know who Van Helsing was?
Peter Cushing.
It was Peter Cushing. And then they also created The Mummy, who... Peter Cushing, again, he played John Banning. But guess who played the Mummy?
Christopher Lee.
It was Christopher Lee, yes.
I also love that we're like talking about how even though this was like a character kind of created by committee, it's now getting to where different people will step into the writing and directing chair and like have their own spin on it. It feels very much like comic arcs, how you'll talk about like, oh yeah, the Spider-Man arc where so-and-so was writing, and like, just like we now define Doctor Who in the Moffat years. I like that it does become this sort of thing where we do have a showrunner and creator, but it's their vision defining a certain small part of the grander arc.
We'll get to one of those writers and kind of his arc as well, because it is really interesting to like dive into like certain years. So like if you wanted to, you can most recently go through like the Stephen Moffat years of Doctor Who, and there's definitely some things to enjoy out of that. But I think you'll enjoy the writer that I cover soon.
All right.
But anyway, back to Baker. The most notable storylines to come out of Baker's run was The Ark in Space, which was done in 1975, Genesis of the Daleks, which was in 1975 as well, The Brain of Morbius, also in 76, The Deadly Assassin, and The Robots of Death. Producer Hinchcliffe's time with the Doctor would soon come to an end when Doctor Who went under some heavy criticism led by conservative activist Mary Whitehouse, who saw the show as being morally corrupt and too violent for children. Hinchcliffe left and was replaced with Graham Williams, who Baker saw was devoted to the Doctor but lacked the flair Hinchcliffe had. What ultimately led to Baker leaving the show was they did not see, quote, eye to eye with the producer John Nathan Turner. Baker was making suggestions about the show and how it shouldn't have to rely on the Doctor for everything, but John was not listening to any of these suggestions. Baker would end up playing the Doctor for 7 seasons up until 1981, making him still the longest acting Doctor in Doctor Who history.
Wow.
And I think when a lot of people, like when you meet a lot of like older Doctor Who fans, Tom Baker is like the guy that they're mostly talking about.
And I imagine those are the kind of years that get parodied the most. Like I mentioned Inspector Spacetime, the community parody of Doctor Who is probably kind of one of the biggest things, but it definitely seems to be more of this 60s or 70s era camp sci-fi. And I'm guessing that a lot of that kind of thing is mostly inspired by those Tom Baker years.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Like even when Epic Rap Battles of History, when Watsky comes in and raps like Doctor Who, he is Tom Baker's Doctor Who.
I'm a mystical medical talk at the pinnacle shifting my physical form. You're a possibly pedophilic individual who should have never been born. You got your knickers in a twist while you're sucking on my Piccadilly, but I'm a lot different, because you're a pitiful hillbilly hanging with an edible kid who's a buck chicken.
It is that much of a staple in Doctor Who. But I kind of wanted to go off on a little tangent to talk about one writer. In 1977, writer Douglas Adams was laying down drunk in a field in Innsbruck, Austria. With him, he carried a book titled The Hitchhiker's Guide to Europe. While he was staring into space, he thought to himself, somebody ought to write Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Thus, the idea for The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy was born, but not as a book, but as a radio show that he pitched to producer Simon Brett of BBC Radio 4 and eventually got it produced. In 1978, he submitted the pilot episode of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy to the Doctor Who production office. I think as a writing sample, this part of the story wasn't exactly clear. It just said that script got over there somehow, and because of that, he got hired on as a writer for Doctor Who.
I had no idea about this.
Yeah. So while he was there, he wrote the storylines The Pirate Planet, City of Death, which he actually did under the pseudonym David Agnew, and Shada. Shada is another storyline, not another pseudonym. He wrote another script called Doctor Who and the Cricket Men, which he never got made, but it did get repurposed for a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy radio series that was then renamed to Life, the Universe, and Everything.
Yeah. So
in this story, the Doctor and his companion would visit a planet designer from Magrathea. All of the Doctor Who storylines have been made into novelizations and were usually written by the writers of the teleplays. For Adams, he did not want to do this, partially because he was working on the radio show and the novel for Hitchhiker's Guide. So he was pretty much busy as is. And when the production offered to have someone else ghostwrite the novels, he actually refused to have anyone else write his work and asked for an unreasonable amount of money from the publishers to write the book, which ended all their pursuits to actually make the novel. Shada was later adapted into a novel by Gareth Roberts in 2012, approximately 11 years after Douglas Adams' death. City of Death and Pirate Planet, they were both written by James Goss, and they were published in 2015 and 2017. So yeah, you have technically experienced a Doctor Who episode and didn't even realize it because it was disguised in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
I definitely remember all of this stuff of like the Cricket Planet.
I knew that Douglas Adams was a writer for Doctor Who, and I never actually knew the story behind it. My thought was that he was just one of the writers there, and to blow off steam or frustration, he would just like go off to the side and just like start writing Hitchhiker's Guide to be like, if they're not going to take any of my ideas, I'm just going to write them down myself. That's what I thought it was. Turns out I was completely wrong about that. And that's the actual true story as to why he wrote for Doctor Who and created Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which I did not know was a radio show first. I always knew it as a book my entire life.
Oh, you didn't realize it was a radio show first?
No, I didn't. I had no idea.
I remember having the books, the trilogy in 5 parts in high school. And then somewhere in high school, I learned it was a radio show and immediately got the radio show and listened to all of it.
But yeah, that's his run. I will say that if you are an obsessive completionist, Doctor Who may not be the show for you. So currently, about 97 episodes are missing as a result of the BBC's policy to regularly clear and destroy their archives to make room for more programs.
Yeah.
That policy ended in 1978. This was a consequence of the Actors Union Unity fighting against the introduction of TV recording around the 1950s. The reasoning behind this is that if a station wanted to re-air a program, they would have to rehire the same cast to make that episode again with additional fees. If the production recorded that episode, they could re-air that episode over and over and over again and not give anything to the actors who were in that initial performance. This was obviously before the ideas of residuals and reruns, which were introduced by both Desi Arnaz and Lucille Ball for I Love Lucy. So that's the reason why I Love Lucy is so revolutionary as a television show and why it's still relevant today is because they were the first ones to come up with this idea of like recording the episode. Like no one had ever heard of recording a TV show on film until I Love Lucy. Everything else was like videotape or like it was pretty direct.
Thinking about that from legal aspect and really labor rights aspect of things. Being able to fight for residuals is also something that makes it so film preservation becomes that much more important and preservation of these TV shows and stuff.
What's crazy is like residuals is still a thing that's being fought today. We had this recently with Scarlett Johansson having to sue Disney because she was not receiving any residuals for the streaming profits that Disney got. They're probably using contracts that are like decades old with things that are outdated.
That's part of the reason there's been like multiple writer strikes in the last 20 years, a lot of that stuff.
There was the big writer strike, I want to say it was like around 2012.
Well, the big one I remember is 2008. That was when Heroes lost half a season. I was a big fan of Heroes at the time, and I remember that was the year that season 2 of Heroes was filmed, and then the writer's strike happened halfway through filming. That was also when James Bond, Quantum of Solace was made, and that was made without a writer, and it was literally Daniel Craig and the director writing that movie as they went. That was also when Tropic Thunder was made because Ben Stiller, not being a WGA writer, could make this movie outside of the guild.
That's interesting.
It's also when Dr. Horrible was made.
I will say that there is going to be possibly, if they don't get their negotiations straight, there's going to be another strike in Hollywood that's going to be going on, and this is going to be for the...
with IATSE, right?
Yeah, IATSE, the grips, gaffers, Basically, a lot of crew members who feel as if they were overworked, especially during the pandemic, because
oh yeah,
a lot of these shows, even though a lot of them shut down, like some of them still had to keep going, and they had to bring crew members on set.
And I'm sure there would have been a lot of unsafe working conditions.
Yep, a lot of unsafe working conditions. They're asking for a larger turnaround time because even though they say like there can only be 8 hours of turnaround until the next day, they're kind of like low key under the table skirting around that.
Yeah, and giving people like 6 hours.
Yeah, it's like 6 hours, 4 hours, or like something crazy like that. And essentially they're fighting for resting hours and just not overworking them. That's definitely being exposed right now, and that's going to be something to follow. I'm not sure when this episode's going to be coming out, so it might have already happened, or we might be in the middle of it, but when we're recording right now, we are aware that there's going to be a new strike, and usually all those strikes, whenever they happen, that means something big is going to change in the film industry, and usually like that's the new precedent forward. So back to syndication and reruns and whatnot. This was a mindset that back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, that TV programs were just this fleeting things. You would have to think of watching TV as like going to a play. Like you only experience it in that moment, and you just can't go revisit that moment unless you go back and see the play again, which would be either done by different actors or like it's just performed again in that case. While Doctor Who was in production, it was shot on 2-inch videotape and was broadcast in that format. For the show to be broadcast overseas, BBC Enterprises would telerecord the episode onto 16mm film because film at that time was cheaper to buy and transport compared to videotape.
Now, when you say telerecord, does that mean they film it in videotape and then use film from that videotape?
It's like when you take a movie and you put it onto a film reel for a projector. You're kind of like projecting the program and exposing it onto 60mm film to go through. Yeah.
Okay. I see what you're saying.
So I mentioned before that 97 episodes were currently missing, but throughout the run of Doctor Who's series from 1963 to 1978, there would have been 253 episodes total that were produced that were subject to be destroyed. So a great number of them have been recovered because they sold copies to each episode to foreign TV stations where a lot of them were recovered.
That makes sense.
So 31 episodes were recovered from CKVU and TVU in Canada, 15 episodes from RKTV in Nigeria, 4 episodes from RTV in Hong Kong, 3 episodes from CBC in Cyprus, 1 from Dubai 33, and 1 from ABC in Australia, for a total of 55. When the BBC Film and Videotape Library did an audit of the engineering department, they were able to find 60 more episodes of Doctor Who, primarily starring John Pertwee. Another major find was from a private collection owned by Ian Levin, who made telerecordings of about 65 episodes. Other recordings of the show have shown up over the years, either from private collections, private recordings of the show, people that have worked on the show prior, TV stations that have held onto copies of episodes that were sold to them. The search is still ongoing for the most part. There has been an effort by the BBC to restore every episode through animation.
Oh, weird.
Many of the missing episodes of Doctor Who have been found, but only the audio has been recovered. So animators have been putting together episodes based on behind-the-scenes photos, clips, screenshots, whatever they can get their hands on to help put these episodes together.
This is also something I find really interesting about film preservation and stuff. You're saying that people found stuff in their private collections. A lot of times there's some film preservation that happens because of people illegally recording stuff.
They ended up being the heroes in the end.
But fans often do a better job than the actual companies. I mean, I know this is a big thing that gets talked about with video games, because video games, every new generation, games have to be programmed differently. And that's starting to not be the case as much, but especially pre-discs for video games, every system couldn't play what was on the previous system, and so those games would be lost, but fans would preserve them with ROMs and stuff, and then companies would send legal action notices to these people for preserving something that couldn't be played otherwise.
Now, I won't mention who this is, but someone that I grew up with, I know that they hacked into their PS2 and was able to actually put in a bunch of like these really old games, like NES games and Sega Genesis games that were just like preserved, but like all kind of put together as this package. There was like no legal way of doing this. So like this was just being shared around. And there's something that you had to solder it into the motherboard in order for you to get all of these games.
Oh, that's awesome.
It's not like people are pirating them to really profit off of them.
Yeah.
But they are pirating it because they want it. They want it. They want to preserve it. They want to keep it on their own terms. And usually the conventional way of doing so is not present.
Yeah.
Or very expensive.
I mean, I was just playing through all of the games in the Legend of Zelda series, and there were 2 games. The only way to get them at the time was through a digital store through the Wii U that was then shut down 6 months later. So I almost was not able to complete the whole series legally, and then the only way I would have been able to do it was with ROMs.
Yeah.
Sometimes that stuff gets lost just because it gets lost, like especially old school films. But there's also things where it's like companies, you could do more, especially nowadays. You could do more to preserve your stuff.
For the few of the episodes that were recorded, an effort has been put in to restore the footage. Now, if you're not fond of waiting for these episodes to be restored and animated, it is still possible to listen to a lot of these episodes which are released in audio forms and in novelizations for each of the serial storylines. So I knew about novelizations. I didn't realize how it was baked into the system. You create this TV series, and then basically they just went to the writer of each of the series that they did for Doctor Who, and they said, all right, now you have to do a novelization of it. I know I mentioned it before with Douglas Adams, where he just refused to do it altogether, but that seemed to be the norm, that if you wanted people to experience the story again, really the only way that you could do it without buying a really expensive VHS, which I don't think was even around.
That was like 80s, right?
I don't know my history about VCRs, but I think that was like the 80s is when they started to become regularly used. But yeah, prior to, if you wanted to experience a movie again, like you're not going to be able to see that in theaters. You could probably find a screening somewhere, but the only way you could do it is by reading the novelization. So that seems to be the case, and it seems like every story of Doctor Who has been preserved in that form at least.
Mm-hmm.
In 1981, Peter Davison replaced Tom Baker in the role of the Doctor.
Pete Davidson?
Peter Davison.
Oh.
And the regeneration?
I don't know. I can feel it isn't going to be as smooth as on other occasions.
At the time, he was 29 when he got the gig, making him the youngest actor to portray the Doctor. Now, that baton has been passed on to Matt Smith when he took on the role when he was 26 years old and is still the youngest Doctor to ever get that role. Davidson would stay on the role for 3 years, as advised by Patrick Troughton, to avoid burnout and being typecast. Next to fill the role was Colin Baker, which surprised Baker when he got the role because in a prior season, more specifically the serial Arc of Infinity, he was cast in the role of Commander Maxwell.
The Doctor seems to be taking it quite well, in fact.
He was excited when he got the chance to be on Doctor Who as Maxwell, but was sad afterwards, thinking that he lost his opportunity to actually be the Doctor himself. Fortunately for him, he got cast because producer John Nathan Turner, who enjoyed his performance as Commander Maxwell. This would be explained away by saying that the Doctor's regeneration could take on the appearance of other beings that he's encountered in the past. This opened up the opportunity later on for actor Peter Capaldi, who, prior to being cast as the 12th Doctor, he portrayed Caecilius in the episode The Fires of Pompeii. Colin Baker was seen as a controversial role. The Doctor was much more cynical and oftentimes came off as mean. There was even a scene when the Doctor attempts to strangle his companion, played by Perry Brown.
Well, we all know the fate of alien spies!
The show went through a format change, going from a half-an-hour program to an hour-long, extending the runtime from 25 minutes to 50 minutes. The show was in a lot of hot water. The viewers were down. The episodes then premiered on Mondays, then moved to Saturdays. It looked like the show was on its way out. When Michael Grade joined the BBC as the channel's controller in 1985, he was quite vocal about the fact that he did not like Doctor Who. Even before he got hired, he was very vocal about that. And when he got hired, he attempted to cancel the show. Turns out that was not a good decision. Fans were furious when Grade canceled the show and received major pushback for doing so, especially in the tabloids. Some political cartoonists, they were actually portraying Grade as a Dalek who wanted to exterminate the Doctor Who show. The BBC had no other choice but to bring back the show. Unfortunately, Colin Baker would not be returning. After an 18-month hiatus, the Doctor was back and was portrayed by Sylvester McCoy in 1986.
When you no longer entertain us, you die.
Predictable as ever, gods of Ragnarok.
Baker was offered to do a 4-part story arc to conclude his run and regenerate, but Baker refused with a counteroffer, asking if he could do a full season before letting him go. The BBC did not take that offer. To reboot the series, McCoy dressed as the 6th Doctor in a blonde wig. The episode began with an injured Doctor who would regenerate into the 7th Doctor. This is kind of like with Crispin Glover in Back to the Future Part 2, where he asked for a higher salary than Michael J. Fox. And they're like, you know what? We're going to cast you with a different person and flip him upside down so that no one knows the difference. So in 1989, the viewers began to decline again, and the show was premiering in less favorable time slots. Doctor Who was canceled, this time under the leadership of Peter Cregeen, BBC's head of series. Throughout 1990, the BBC promised the return of the Doctor with no plans in sight to actually bring back the show. This is when we're going to start entering into that weird lull period where we just didn't see the Doctor at all. So the BBC was hoping that the show would get picked up by an independent company to carry on with the show. The mentality was fueled by the fact that during the filming of the 26th season in July of 1989, Philip Siegel, a British expatriate who worked in the television department at Columbia Pictures in the US, approached the BBC to make Doctor Who. The hope was to launch the series as an American production. Siegel contacted as many networks as possible to pick up the show, and Fox Network was the only one willing to take on the risk, but not as a TV show, but as a made-for-TV movie that would serve as a backdoor pilot episode, meaning that if the movie was successful and the demand was high enough, the series would continue as if that was the first episode.
It's interesting to me that, like, normally these American versions happen because this thing is at the height of its popularity and we gotta make it over here. But this is a case where it's like, oh, nobody cares about Doctor Who right now, so let's try to get it made somewhere else to bring the energy back to it.
Yeah. And it's definitely one of those shows where, like, if you bring in a new showrunner, which seems to be the case often, where, like, just bring in a new producer. I don't think they really have showrunners because they never mention that, but they do mention that they have a lot of producers who, like, create the projection of where the show is going.
Yeah.
So it's not uncommon to see, like, well, we could shop this around, and as long as the elements are there, like, we can still make this a pretty entertaining series, and still that person can make it their own, or whoever's running whatever studio, they can make it their own as long as, like, everything that's established is already there. So the production was put together with the help of Universal Pictures, the BBC, and BBC Worldwide, making this a US British production. The production went through its own development hell. Casting the role for the Doctor didn't begin until March of 1994. Keep in mind, they started this in 1990, and Siegel pitched this idea to bring it over to the US in 89. Some of the actors who auditioned were William Cunningham, which you might know as Davos from Game of Thrones.
Okay.
Mark McGann, Robert Lindsay, Tom McLerney, Nathaniel Parker, Peter Woodward, John Sessions, Anthony Head, which you might recognize as Giles from Buffy.
Okay.
And Tony Slattery. Two of the actors who were asked to audition were Christopher Eccleston and Peter Capaldi, but both of them actually declined the offer. They would later go on to play the 9th and the 12th Doctor.
Interesting. Now, it sounds like, even though this is going to be an American production, they're still going for a British Doctor. It's not to keep going back to Community, but that's like my touch point for this universe. There's a whole episode in season 4 of Community where they're talking about an American version of Inspector Spacetime. But that is like specifically an American version with an American Doctor in the same way that American Office is.
Yeah, I think what they wanted to do with this instead was to go in the 007 route, where like 007 is created by MGM, which is an American company, but yet they still stay true to this being like a Europe-focused movie.
It's still an American production, but with British cast members. Since they're going with British cast still, is this supposed to still be a continuation of the original BBC show, or would this be a complete reboot?
So this would be a continuation of it.
Okay.
So ultimately, the role, it went to Paul McGann, and he ended up playing the 8th Doctor.
Okay.
So he is known in canon, in the Doctor Who universe, he is the 8th Doctor.
Interesting.
The production took place in Vancouver, the first time Doctor Who has ever been filmed in North America, even though the plot takes place in San Francisco's Chinatown, which I thought was really interesting because if you remember the American Inspector Spacetime, they land in San Francisco. The hope that producer Philip Siegel had was to gain a new American audience while appealing to the original Doctor Who fans that grew up with the series. This being a movie, the production was on a grander scale. It was actually shot on 35mm film. The movie was more action-packed, and they used state-of-the-art special effects and didn't have to rely on a lot of the cheap effects the original series did, which ultimately, like, that's kind of the charm of watching Doctor Who. Like, we understand the Daleks. You can just push them over. They seem so flimsy, but you kind of suspend your belief to be like, oh, this is one of the most dangerous beings in the universe. And you just kind of accept that, even though they're kind of like scooting around like a big salt shaker. We accept that as like, that's kind of the charm. It's like, they didn't have the money to do this, but they still made it work. They made it creative in a way.
Yeah.
Whereas special effects, it can enhance a lot of stuff, but it also can kind of ruin a lot of things as well. Like we see this with a lot of superhero movies where like nothing seems to be visually spectacular anymore just because almost anything can be done if you're using CGI and it doesn't feel special. Whereas when you start using practical effects, like if you watch John Wick, knowing that a lot of the effects and the fighting in there,
or Mission Impossible.
Yeah, like a lot of them are practical, or even like Christopher Nolan, where he's like, yeah, I'm going to crash a plane. And they're like, it's going to be CG, right? And he's like,
yeah,
I don't think so. It's more impressive going that route. But this is also going towards the late 90s where doing CG stuff seemed to be the answer to a lot of limitations in film.
Yeah.
Who are you?
I was dead too long this time. The anesthetic almost destroyed the regenerative process.
Yeah. Right.
So what happened? Why didn't it work? So the movie ultimately did get made, but they tried to make the Doctor relatable and understood. The Doctor isn't really meant to be understood.
Mm-hmm.
They're like a Sherlock Holmes type characters where you're just more enthralled with like their method of madness and not really trying to psychoanalyze who Sherlock Holmes is. Like, why does he have OCD or anything like that? It's like, no, we just accept that this is just his method and this is who he is.
The characters who actually go on arcs are not the Doctor, but it's companions, or it's the people they interact with. And I can't remember. I know there's some term for this kind of a protagonist of, instead of them going on an arc like Frodo or Luke Skywalker, those are characters going on their own arc, but instead this is a character who is changing everybody else around them, which is something more like Superman or Paddington. You know, a character who doesn't change themselves, but the story is about how they affect everybody else.
So Editor Dan here. I actually looked into what David was talking to. David was actually talking about a static protagonist, which is a main character that we follow, but their personality doesn't change, just like Sherlock Holmes, or in this case, Doctor Who. But the characters around them, they become dynamic characters who do change because of the static protagonists.
Most stories, your protagonist is the person who's changing. I get the impression that for the Doctor, it's everybody else around them that's changing.
Yeah, and that's kind of why this movie didn't really work. So you're dealing with an audience who's primarily Americans who have never experienced Doctor Who, and they are having a huge crash course of information right from the beginning. Why does the Doctor regenerate? Why does he forget who he was? What is the planet Skaro? What are Daleks? And why do they look like giant pepper shakers? Who's the Master? What's the Time Lord? It's a lot of questions to be thrown at you at once to be like, do you understand? And be like, no, you gave me so much stuff. I don't know why people like this anymore. They're so complicated.
Yeah.
And then if you're a Doctor Who fan, on the other side, you have to sit through this exposition dump. And really, you just want to get to the adventure. And you just want to see what he does. And one of the more insulting things about the movie is that they didn't even feature the Daleks or Skaro or any of those places. They really just do a nod to it.
What's the Eye of Harmony?
It's the power source at the heart of the TARDIS.
The TARDIS? What's a TARDIS?
The TARDIS is my ship. It carries me through time and space. TARDIS, it stands for time and relative dimension in space.
And this master, is he like the devil?
The master is a rival Time Lord.
Time Lord,
Pure
oh my
evil.
God.
I was bringing home his remains from Skara, where his final incarnation had been exterminated by the Daleks, or so we thought.
You really are insane.
There were some other inconsistencies with the movie as well. The Doctor kisses his protagonist, which is really strange because the Doctor is asexual and has never done that before. He also claims that he's half human, which is strange because that's never been in the lore at all. He's always just been an alien. Also, the power source of the TARDIS is wrong. Even though 9.1 million viewers from the UK tuned in, only 5.6 million Americans viewed and watched the Doctor Who movie, proving that it was not a series that was likely to move past this. This looked like this was the end of Doctor Who as a television series, even though licensed novels, audio plays would provide new stories about the Doctor. For Paul McGann, this was not the end of his journey as the Doctor. Even though the TV series was not approved, 9 audio drama series were created and released after the film, which he actually voiced the character of the Doctor for. 9 novels were written with McGann's approval to use his image on the cover. He's also depicted in a few graphic novels as well. He would later reprise his role on screen, and that will explain later in the reboot.
That's got to be weird to, like, the thing you were cast for, the TV show, not actually get made, but you're still associated with this character for all of this other ancillary material. That's such a weird and unique position that I'm, like, trying to think if there's anything I've heard of that's somewhat similar.
Like, there's a lot of IPs that go beyond just movies. So, like, Star Wars is probably the biggest example that I can think of. But, like, if you go into a lot more smaller properties, Avatar: The Last Airbender, those adventures continued on through the graphic novels. Same thing with Buffy as well. Even though Buffy didn't really have a great ending, it continued on in graphic novels and continued that story. So
this would be like if B. Arthur's character from the Star Wars Holiday Special continued showing up in things and she recorded audiobooks and her likeness was used on novels and comic books, as opposed to it being this one-off thing in this weird side project.
Yeah. That would be great, though. I mean, you would know more than I would, because someone has had to have made The Adventures of B. Arthur in the Star Wars universe.
Acmina, I think, is her character's name.
I just remember she was the owner of the cantina.
Yeah. The thing is like, official stuff, it's really hard to find nods to it, because Lucasfilm before Disney never wanted to acknowledge the holiday special.
That's right.
Since the Disney buy, there have been a couple of small nods, like Life Day gets brought up in The Mandalorian. I don't know how many references to even Acmina's character specifically there is, if her character ever shows up in anything else.
Yeah. So in September of 2003, BBC announced the new Doctor Who series was in the works, led by BBC Samurai Whale's head of drama, Julia Gardner, and writer Russell T. Davies, who also wrote for Queer as Folk, The Second Coming, and Casanova. During the 90s, Davies attempted to pitch the idea to rework the Doctor Who series that would be more modern and better suited for the 20th century audience. Unfortunately, the rights for Doctor Who were tied up with Fox and Universal when they were attempting to make the film, and finally was released back to the BBC in 2003. Davies was a huge fan of the Doctor when he first saw William Hartnett regenerate into the second Doctor, portrayed by Patrick Troughton. He would even write reviews of each episode in his diary as a kid. His favorite writer of the show was Robert Holmes, who wrote his favorite series, The Ark in Space. In 1987, Davies submitted a spec script which got rejected by script editor Andrew Cartmel. Cartmel suggested that he should write a more prosaic story about a man who is worried about his mortgage, his married, and his dog. The script would eventually be reworked as The Long Game, which ended up being the 7th episode in the rebooted series. In 2003, Davies voluntarily wrote a 15-page pitch for the pilot. He described the Doctor as, quote, your best friend, someone you would want to be around all the time, and his companion, 19-year-old Rose Tyler, as a, quote, perfect match for the new Doctor. He also retained a lot of the key elements of Doctor Who, the TARDIS, the sonic screwdriver, Daleks, removal of the Time Lords, and a greater focus on humanity. BBC Worldwide approved of the series for 13 episodes. 8 of those episodes were written by Davies, 2 of them written by Stephen Moffat. Mark Gatiss, Robert Sherman, and Paul Cornell all wrote 1 episode each. The transition and explanation of the 8th Doctor to the 9th Doctor is a little tricky to explain. As of now, we have the 13th Doctor, who is portrayed by Jodie Whittaker, and yet we have 14 actors who have played the Doctor on screen. This does not include any of the actors used in the audio stories, because there's a lot more actors who have portrayed the Doctor in that.
Mm-hmm.
Paul McGann is considered canon in the lore of Doctor Who. Even though the made-for-TV film is considered the last Airbender movie that most fans would like to forget about, obviously the TV movie did not launch a potential for a reboot or a revival of the series, but instead, the books and audio dramas mentioned before. In July of 2003, the BBC announced another Doctor Who web series called Scream of the Shalka.
No wonder you're all afraid.
Sound makes you afraid.
I am Prime, War Chief of the Shalka Confederacy.
Homo sapiens has minutes to live. Go on.
It was a 6-part Flash animated series that ran from November 13th to December 18th of 2003. The Doctor was voiced by Richard E. Grant, and because the series was approved by the BBC, he was actually considered the 9th Doctor. After Russell T. Davies was approved for the relaunch of the series, it was then made canon that Christopher Eccleston was then to play the 9th Doctor. Richard Grant was no longer referred to as the 9th Doctor, but now known as the Shalka Doctor. More confusion was stirred up during the 50th anniversary episode, The Day of the Doctor, depicting the last day of the Time War. In it, the current Doctor at the time, Matt Smith, the 11th Doctor, teams up with his previous self, the 10th Doctor, played by David Tennant, and both encounter the incarnation of the Doctor, the War Doctor, depicted by John Hurt.
Pretending you weren't the Doctor when you were the Doctor more than anybody else. You were the Doctor on the day it wasn't possible to get it right. But this time, you don't have to do it alone.
Now, this had to be explained because Christopher Eccleston, he was actually supposed to play this role. For personal reasons, he never wants to reprise the role of the Doctor. In fact, if you watch his run, he only plays the Doctor in the first season, and after that, he's left the series. I guess he just had a bad experience with it and just doesn't want to go back to that character. So John Hurt had to step in to fill that role. And John Hurt kind of is now just like representing all past Doctors. So instead of trying to get like as many of the Doctors into the show, although some of them did make cameos in it, or not in the 50th, but they did like shorts where they made cameos. But John Hurt is really there just to represent all the older Doctors. Yeah, he's now known as the War Doctor, even though he came after the 8th Doctor, technically. To clear up some confusion, just before the premiere of The Day of the Doctor, BBC released a mini episode on the BBC's website on November 14th, 2013 called The Night of the Doctor, where Paul McGann, he reprised his role as the Doctor, explained his regeneration to becoming the War Doctor, John Hurt, where we see John Hurt take on the role as the War Doctor for the first time.
Doctor no more.
In The Day of the Doctor, that's when we see the War Doctor then regenerate into the 9th Doctor, Christopher Eccleston. So we have technically-ish 3 9th Doctors. But then to go back to the rebooted series, April 2nd, 2004, the BBC announced that the Doctor would be Christopher Eccleston. But before this was all made official, other actors that were considered for the role were Bill Nye, Richard E. Grant, who played him in the radio drama, Anthony Head, I thought this was interesting. Eddie Izzard.
Oh,
Eddie Izzard as a doctor would be really interesting.
That would have been interesting.
Hugh Grant and Alan Davies. The series continues to this day under the control of the BBC. Who knows where it's going to go from there on out.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's kind of the history of Doctor Who. I couldn't really pinpoint like one thing that did not get made entirely, but the reason why I went with this is just because I knew about the American made-for-TV movie and the potential of where it went from there. But I did like that I discovered by accident, like I had no idea about this, by accident, the whole story with Douglas Adams.
Yeah.
And him being a writer for it. And his story getting shot down only to be used in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Yeah. By the way, I did find Acmena has now showed up in canon in the 2017 collection of short stories From a Certain Point of View.
Ooh.
A book with 40 short stories written by different people, and each one is a different side character of A New Hope. For some of the Cantina stories, Acmena gets a mention.
Yay. That's cool.
But she was never canonized outside of the holiday special, except for that.
Boo. Well, yeah, that's Doctor Who.
All right. Yeah, that's Doctor Who. Sorry, I feel bad. I'm like, I know people get super passionate about Doctor Who. It's one of those things where I'm like, hey, that's cool that it exists. It's cool that people like it. I don't have anything personally against it. And honestly, I think what it is it's because of what you said, Dan, that this is not a show for completionists, because I am a completionist, and I would not be able to watch this show knowing that there are things that I can't watch.
Yeah. I guess you have more similar feelings towards like Red Dwarf as well, where like I did go through a good run of Doctor Who and got immersed within like that fandom as well. So I got to approach it that way, but going through the production of it, like that is where I was almost completely blind to a lot of that stuff and how that was all put together, which I think for a lot of Doctor Who fans who are more immersed, which I assume more people are immersed in the lore of Doctor Who rather than the production behind it. I think a lot of this might be eye-opening for those who have been long fans of the Doctor.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you everybody so much for listening. If you want to find more episodes of this podcast, you can go check out our website, pipedreampodcast.com. And while you're there, you can also check out other shows such as Come On Fahoogwa Pod's Escape from Vault Disney and the Mystery Shack Look Back. You can also find our social media pages. We're on Twitter at HDTNGM. We're on Instagram at How Did This Not Get Made? And you can send us your emails, notgetmade@gmail.com. That's going to be it for today. Thank you everybody so much for listening.
Thank you.